Welcome, everyone, to the Embracing Brokenness Podcast. I have with me today a special guest, Chuck Girard, singer, songwriter, recording artist, and worship leader. He's one of the pioneers of contemporary Christian music. He was co-founder and lead singer of the group Love Song from its beginning to the present. Born in Los Angeles and raised in both Southern and Northern California, Chuck began playing music at an early age. In his teens, he formed a group called the Castells, which had two national top 20 hits, Sacred and So This Is Love. They also released the song I Do, which was produced by Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. It was during this time, as a teenager, that Chuck shared the stage with stars such as Roy Orbison, Jan and Dean, Jerry Lee Lewis, Bobby V, Jackie Wilson, Brenda Lee, and others. This led to a successful career as a studio singer and musician, which included singing the lead vocals on the HONDELLS' first two albums and their biggest hit, Little Honda. In his early 20s, Chuck became disillusioned with life and, like so many of his generation, began experimenting with drugs. This led to a 5-year search for God through LSD, Eastern religion, and a committed hippie lifestyle. His search ended in 1970 at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa when he found true spiritual reality through accepting Jesus Christ as his Savior. Girard was already in a group called Love Song, and along with the conversions of the band members came the radical change in their message. Previously, playing clubs, preaching peace and love, and LSD as the way to find God, they now had a new message. And with this change, helped blaze the path for the beginnings of what would become known as the Jesus movement and contemporary Christian music. Chuck played with Love Song for the next 3 years before launching solo with his first self-titled album, Chuck Girard, that produced his most renowned song, Sometimes Alleluia. Chuck has released many albums, toured the U.S., Europe, and Australia several times, both solo and the Chuck Girard Band. He was touring in Indonesia, Africa, Mexico, Canada, and most recently, the Middle East. In 1981, at the peak of his solo career, Chuck left the spotlight of the concert scene and focused his attention on the new direction that God had birthed, a return to the simplicity of worship and the church. In this capacity, Chuck, to this day, ministers through music, worship, and teaching all around the United States and the world. Chuck has appeared with Billy Graham and on the 700 Club, 100 Huntley Street, Trinity Broadcasting Network, and various television shows throughout the world. John 9:25 says this, I was blind, but now I see. This is where it all started for Chuck. Chuck and his wife, Karen, have 4 daughters, 3 granddaughters, and 2 grandsons. And if you tuned in the last time around, you met Elisa Childers, who is one of Chuck's daughters. So without further ado, part 1 in our podcast today with Chuck Girard. Chuck, thanks so much for taking the time to join me. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
So I have to admit something that as I look between the two of us, and for anybody watching on video, they'll pick this up, but I would say that probably for both of us, we have more years in the rearview mirror than we do have ahead of us, right? In that windshield.
Oh, yeah, well perceived. Yeah.
Yeah.
Barrel.
Big giveaway. But that being said, like we could do this interview for a long, long time, but what I'm excited to bring our audience today is your story. You went through a lot. And, you know, for anyone that's tuning in and all to what Embracing Brokenness Ministries is about, is that we explore the things of God, and we are totally imperfect. None of us have that nailed down. So our brokenness is real. And so what you have expressed in this book that you wrote, which I highly recommend to anybody, I'm holding it up right now, Rock and Roll Preacher from Doo-Wop to Jesus Rock, which, by the way, how did you recall all this? Did you journal? Did you journal a lot?
No, I'll tell you, the vetting on that book was unbelievable. Fortunately, for each segment of my life, pre-Christian, when I was in rock, doo-wop and rock and roll music, most of my people that I was involved with were alive. So what I would do is I would take the passages, the pages that pertained to them, and I'd send it to him, and I'd say, like, you can add, you can correct, you can do whatever you want. And then I kind of put it all together and made stitched together a composite memory of all of us to get it as accurate as possible. I did the same thing with the love song guys. The drug years were the hardest because, like the old saying goes, if you remember the 60s, you weren't alive or something.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's extremely vetted. We really tried to get all the facts correct. So thank you. But yeah, it took a long time.
Well, I'll tell you, you did a wonderful job. And what I probably appreciate more than anything else is your authenticity, your transparency, and your willingness to tell your own story of brokenness and how God just took you out of the depths of all that. And oh my gosh, we as a group now, all of us that are still alive and even generations after you have been benefiting from not only your music, but your testimony and certainly the movement, the Jesus movement that took place with you at the center, right? So if you don't mind, I'd like to start in the beginning just to give our audience a sense of, what this was like for you, even as a kid growing up. And I think you start the book, you title it 1969, and you take the reader back to a place where I guess it was Vegas in 69. And then you walk us right into childhood. So set the stage for us. Tell us a little bit about what life was like then and how you pulled that together.
Yeah. Well, it was a very strange bringing up for a young guy. A lot happened between the times I was 1 and 5 years old. My father, the story is he committed suicide. It was drugs and alcohol. And he died when I was about 4. And home life was, the interesting part of this, as far as my brokenness or whatever you want to say, was that I just thought this was kind of normal childhood for every kid. You don't really think about this being unusual, just what people go through. Of course, you don't really have the capability to really evaluate it, but it never struck me that I was broken or abused or anything. But there was a lot of abuse. A lot of it was subtle, but a lot of it was very overt, and big arguments with between my mom and dad. I remember, I think it's in the book, where I tried to be my mother's protector, and my father was hurting her in some way, and I was grabbing his leg, trying to pull him off my mother. And he was an alcoholic and a philanderer. And then we had moved out of the house that I lived in when I was that young, was in Altadena, and we had moved in with my grandparents in Pasadena by the time my father died. And I remember getting the call that your dad had died, and it was presented to me, as tactfully as possible. But I remember being very empty about it. I didn't feel sad. I didn't really feel relief or anything. It was just like, okay, my dad's dead. And so that shows me a little bit of a blockage there, that I was blocking things even at that young age. And then there were other incidents. My grandfather was a very old country guy. I'm actually my lineage is actually pretty pure for an American. I'm actually 50% whatever French Canadian is, probably the French that over to Canada, and then 50% Swedish. So and 100% Czechoslovakian. I'm Bohemian. So that means my grandfather and grandmother were 100% Bohemian, and they had that old country, the man ruled the house, and when the phone rang, everybody shut up because grandpa was on the phone and everything stopped. And and he was quite erratic himself. And then my mother was kind of going off the rails at this point. She had mental problems. She actually went to a hospital and had shock treatments. Yeah. Wow. It's amazing. Yeah. And then she told me later on, I guess she left her body and had because she didn't want to talk about drugs, because that always reminded her of that. So it was that kind of a mess. There was no real stability, no father figure in my life, really. My grandfather was, alternately a great guy, and also could be a very, very overpowering and kind of mean person when he got upset. He did drink alcohol. It wasn't like my father, but those things all changed his mood. But he was my father figure. And I think I said in the book that by and large, I was loved. I felt loved. It wasn't like I felt like I was an outsider and I had to, I was just this castaway put into my room where nobody wanted to be near me. So that's part of the reason I never recognized how bad things were until later on. You look back at it in retrospect, And in high school, I was the class clown because I was so insecure. I had to have some way to get attention. And yeah, so I would say that I was dysfunctional family, and I was raised in that atmosphere. And for looking back on it, I have two sisters and a half sister. We all came out of it pretty well. My one sister is a strong Christian, my younger sister, and my older sister has not received the Lord, but she's basically a normal person. So there's ways that God gets us through all this stuff. But yeah, I would say it was a traumatic to a certain degree. Not like some kids. You read about these serial killers and they're abused, sexually abused, beaten to a pulp. Nothing like that. More subtle, but still,
Right.
it's very deep at that point because you're so young.
Well, right. And you mentioned trauma. I mean, nobody can escape events in our lives that are pretty traumatic. And that varies, as you said, depending on the people. But, I remember you recalled a story where your father took you to a place, and I think you referred to it as still having a fear of heights as a result of it. So it was a pretty traumatic event, wasn't it? And you also had something that happened in a swimming pool. Like tell the audience about those things.
Well, yeah, there was that was so traumatic that the incident I'm going to talk about now is where a truck went over a thing called, we have a place called Devil's Gate Dam. It's still there in Pasadena, near Pasadena, California. And that was big news. And my father was kind of an ambulance chaser a little bit, he wasn't a lawyer or anything, but
Right.
he liked to get in on the excitement. And he heard that the truck had gone over the side, and it was about 100-foot drop. And I still remember the color of the truck today. It was a red truck. And my father wanted me to see it. And he picked me up. He had been drinking, and he held me over the side. And I kind of remember it was almost like in the movies where the thing you're looking at comes up. Raises. It was like that. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And then later on, my mother told me that my father had often intimated that if he could get rid of us kids, and even her, and just have his normal life. So there could have been a second there where he contemplated dropping me. Who knows? But I know it was a very traumatic experience, and I have a fear of heights to this day. Even when I see something on TV that gets a little woozy, I get a weird feeling. I don't. But the other incident was we lived on St. Pierre Avenue, and the house, if it's still there, I went up to look for it a couple of years ago, and it's either remodeled or rebuilt. But we had this fish pond in the back, and there was a neighbor's daughter that had gotten in there somehow, and she drowned and died. So that was my first encounter with death, and that was pretty traumatic. Like I say, when my father died, it was kind of almost like a relief. This was very traumatic for me to have this little girl die. And I remember everybody, running around frantic and ambulances coming and the whole thing. So yeah, those were all things that were kind of early experiences that in your long-term memory, those things burn deep. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but
Exactly.
I remember that very vividly. All those I can remember my classmates' names from kindergarten, some of them, so it's weird how our memory works, right?
It is. I agree with you on the long-term memory of the past. But, so often these types of events in our life, and I have a few of my own like that, really impact our view of ourselves, even our view of God. You talked about your father, and you almost disassociated with him in a way, and you tell us later in the book about how God brought you back to this place where you could deal with that loss, right? But during the time, like it's like, okay, Dad's gone now, and it was a relief in some senses, but really you didn't deal with it, right? So there's just these things that we all end up facing in our past that come back at some point or another and impact who we are, how we approach even our own faith when we get saved. So what was that like when you, obviously those are a couple of pretty traumatic experiences, but then you lived with your mom for a number of years, right? Just alone in that case. So I guess you had your siblings with you, right?
Right. My two sisters and myself lived with mom was our breadwinner for a season until she met the man she next married, who became our stepfather. Yeah. Right. So that was probably about 5-year period in there, something like that. Yeah, where my mom, and actually we lived in what we called the bunkhouse, which was a little shack that my grandfather built in the backyard. That's still there today. I've gone back to that property a couple of times, and we lived in there. It had everything we needed except a real kitchen facility, and I think we had a little bit of a stove, but it was very small. It was probably 400 square feet, something like that. And we lived there for years. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you'd all gather in the main house to
Yeah,
eat?
we called it the big house. My grandfather liked that because that's slang for prison. So.
Yeah, right.
But
yeah. Was that foreshadowing, Chuck, or what was that? I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah.
So you were attracted to music, right? Somehow there was a shift when you were younger, and what tell us about that change? What happened there?
You have to be pretty old to remember 78 records, but that was what was around when they were,
Yeah, I remember them. Yep.
And albums were record albums. A little bit of music trivia for the younger folks. When we say the guy put out dropped a new album. Albums came from the fact that they really were albums. They were 6 different envelopes that had 78 in each envelope that had a song on one side. So you got 12 songs, and they were about an inch thick, and it was an actual record album. And my mother had, for some reason, she had Gene Autry records and Mario Lanza records around. Those are the ones I remember. Now, Mario Lanza was a pop tenor that had made some movies in the 50s, and he was very popular. Kind of when I say pop tenor, he sang in a tenor voice, but it was kind of pop songs he did. He didn't do Vesta La Guiba. Yeah. He did Be My Love and stuff. And then Gene Autry, of course, was the cowboy star. And I remember listening to their records and liking both genres, and more than anything, probably operating the 78 record player was more fun than anything. But that got me connected to the idea of music. Now, that wasn't modern music yet. It wasn't rock and roll. That came years later. And in between, I had some piano lessons, classical piano lessons. By this time, we'd moved to San Francisco. We lived there for a few years when my mother remarried. And it wasn't until I heard my sister started bringing home doo-wop records. And man, that just lit my fire. I'll tell you what. Still of the Night by the Five Satins. There was something going on in that music that I loved. And then I heard Elvis, and that was all she wrote. I knew I couldn't be Elvis, but this was something I had to pursue. And I thought, man, that is so awesome. I just loved the sound of it, his voice, his name. Yeah. I thought, I've heard that name before. That's right. I know. But it was a real watershed moment in my life musically. And then the other, I might be ahead of myself a little bit here, but my older sister had a friend that came over. We lived in San Francisco. We actually lived pretty close to what became Haight-Ashbury. Right. Haight at that time was just a regular street. And her friend came over, and she played the chords for Heart and Soul on our piano. We had a little spin piano. And that was another moment of connection with this. It was all kind of like converging on me, this Elvis sound, these chords. And so that excited my interest in music. And I started to learn to play the records that I was collecting by ear. I didn't really pay much attention. I had 2 years of piano, but it was classical. Right. And I wasn't interested in that form of music. But I loved rock and roll and boogie woogie and all that stuff. So I started to sound out these records and figure out what the chords were by ear. And that was the basis of the start of my musical, if you call it, education.
So you must have sang along then to all this stuff, clearly, right?
Hey, the Everly Brothers changed everybody's life because you could third part. They had such perfect harmonies. The Everly Brothers, Bye Bye Love and Wake Up Little Susie. And people I see, these big rock and roll stars that say that they learned to sing harmony by singing with the Everly Brothers. They were very influential group, duo. Yeah, absolutely. And singing along with records was a big deal, and sounding like the record.
Exactly. We just lost our Gen Z audience, by the way. They have no clue who we're talking about right now. But I did the same thing. Behind me is my first guitar. It was a Yamaha 6-string acoustic, and I started to learn to play in high school. Just because I could, and I was excited for the same way you were, and I didn't have the vocal cords you do, but we got ourselves a little garage band together, and and my best friend on drums and a couple other players. Before you know it, we had something that resembled a classic rock was our thing, because I'm a little younger than you, so the 70s was our era. But I know exactly what you're talking about when you say sing along and just get better. So when did you know that you had a set of chords here on your own?
Well, it's funny because it wasn't until I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but I'll come back.
Yeah, that's fine.
I became a hippie and I moved to Hawaii to be a hippie that I discovered my own voice. Up until that point, like I say, I was a copycat singer. And even through my first recordings, there was always something in my mind where I was emulating someone. Make this sound like Frankie Avalon, make this sound like Roy Orbison. And then I did demo work for many years for a guy named Gary Usher, where he'd say, do a little bit like Jerry Lee Lewis or something. And of course I couldn't sound like those guys, but I could kind of cop the style a little bit for a demo record that they were trying to sell to somebody.
Sure.
So, I didn't, when I first heard my voice, we did this song called Zoop. It was the B-side of a record by, I think that the group was called The Charts. They had a song called, let's see my trivia history here. You Cheated, You Lied, I think was the name of the song. And this was a little up-tempo thing, and it had zoop, zoop, dee-doop. And I remember when I first heard my voice recorded, I thought, man, you sound nasal and horrible. And so my first impression of many people say that that when they first hear their speaking voice recorded back, they can't believe it's their voice. But it was a while. But I made all my records that way. I had my own spin on things,
right? But
still had, how would this guy do this song? Let's do I did a song. We did a cover of Some Enchanted Evening in my group called the Castells. Yep. That was actually recently on a Watchman episode. I couldn't believe it.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Did they send you a check for that or not?
No, someone else owns all that.
Yeah.
But it's cool to be remembered, and they actually ran it through the credits, so they played almost the whole song.
That's hilarious. That's great.
I'm modeling it after the Platters lead singer Tony Williams. Some Enchanted, whoa. So there was a lot of that going on. But then when I went to Hawaii and I had my first guitar, because I didn't have a piano anymore, I started to realize what was my voice and what did I sound like, and that was the beginning of that revelation that led to my voice today. Yeah.
Well, that's so cool, because I remember actually when you said in the book buying that guitar was with the money you had from selling your house, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right? Right. And then there's a small little version you took along with you, and but we'll get to that a little bit, I'm sure. But take us back to the Castells. Now that you brought them up, that was what, 62 roughly? When you guys
first 61. We started late 50s. We were in high school, so I graduated in 61. I was probably 2 years earlier when we started the group, and just a bunch of guys that loved doo-wop. And we used to play hooky in our choir class when we were supposed to be rehearsing choir parts. We would rehearse doo-wop tunes because we were getting invitations to play at places like the Elks Club and the crazy stuff that we lived in Santa Rosa, California at the time. And so we met this DJ. His name's Dan Dillon. I actually found the only picture I could ever find of him was in his obituary. I found it about right. Yeah. I didn't know. I actually talked to him a few years earlier, and he was kind of going into dementia. Mm-hmm. I was trying to get to see him again because it's been 60 years or whatever, or 50 years. So anyhow, he had some connections in Hollywood, and he said, I know these different record executives. If you guys make a little demo, I can send you down there with my, introduction, and maybe you can get a record contract. So we made a little demo in San Francisco with $100 that I borrowed from my mom. And it was a place called Sound Recorders, and none of that makes any difference to anybody. Oh, by the way, you said Gen Z; they're very into what we're talking about right now. We're finding out
Really?
from the people that are the kids that are commenting on the Jesus Revolution movie. They
Yes.
love the story, even though they're interested, even though they're not connected personally. Anyhow, so we took that little demo down to Hollywood, and we had 3 or 4 record labels lined up to go visit with. Crystalette was a label that had a song called Tan Shoes and Pink Shoelaces with Dodie Stevens. They had moved their office. We couldn't find them. Long story short, we wound up at Era Records, which was pretty hot at the time. They had a big record on the charts with it had a big record, #1 record with a lady named Gogi Grant. Wayward Wind is a Restless Wind, and they were on a roll, and they had just signed their roster of artists for the year when we came in to see. Herb Newman was his name, and when after we had the meeting, he said, "Guys, I just signed my artists for the year. If you want to sign with someone else, I'll counsel you, if they offer you a contract, but I can't do anything till next year. If you're still around next year, we'll discuss." And about that time, a guy named Billy Sherman walked in the office, a friend of Herb's, and he was part of a very successful publishing company, Sherman Dvorak Music, which was Barry Dvorak, which again, only music people know who that is, but it was big stuff back in those days. And he took Herb took him in the other room. And apparently we stayed outside the room, and they must have listened to the demo, and Billy must have said, "Don't let these guys go, because this is a great sound." Next thing we know, Herb came out and said, "Well, I'm going to make room for you guys. I'm going to sign you if you want to sign." So we signed and went back to Santa Rosa, waited until it was time to record. And so now we had a record contract with Era Records, which was pretty big stuff in those days.
Absolutely.
And, it was an adjustment. One of our singers was his parents were very religious, and good religious. They were actually Christians.
Cool.
They didn't want him going to Hollywood, so they wouldn't let him be in the group. So we had to replace him, and then we went down to LA with the new member. And that guy today that had to leave the group is an awesome pastor near Santa Rosa, California. And we stay in touch, and he always told me how much it hurt him that he is. Let him be. It was very affected his life very deeply. And there's another little story there, right, of brokenness, because he joined the group. Anyhow, those were the kind of little rabbit trails. But so now we had a record contract and ready to go.
That is a great story, by the way. And of course, now I can't not ask you about your first meeting with the Beach Boys. And I think, was it your manager, Mike Connors? Is that how that got set up at the time? Or how did that go down?
You have read the book. Well, the first connection with the Beach Boys was at the sock hop thing, where we would do these sock hops, and what they were is supposedly the kids would come in and take their shoes off because they were always on a gym floor or something like that.
That's where that came from. Okay.
Right. But later on, it just became a generic name. You could wear your shoes and called a sock hop. So we were doing a sock hop, and the Beach Boys were on the bill, but they were nobody at that point. Their record hadn't even come out. So, but our record was on the radio. So I'm sitting there. There was no backstage at most of these things, so we just kind of hung out in an area together. And so one of them came to me and asked if I was in the Castells, and told me he liked the record and asked me for my autograph. So I autographed whatever it was, piece of paper or whatever. And in my mind, I can't prove it. I think it was Brian Wilson.
I love that. Let's say it was.
Yeah. Well, he probably wouldn't even remember it today.
Right.
But anyhow, we met the Beach Boys then. And then, of course, then they took off and became very big. And I was not a Beach Boy fan in the beginning. I thought it was substandard music, bom, bom, dip, 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 dip. I didn't really get that. It wasn't doo-wop. It wasn't pure to me. It was just sort of stupid.
Right.
And then I went over to somebody's house after, I think it was called the Shutdown album or something, and I heard a song called Ballad of Old Betsy, and my ears were, what is that? That is amazing. It's basically a song about a car, but you thought it was about a girl. She was born in 32. Was she ever pretty? And then at the end, the big payoff line is, she may be rusted iron, but to me she's solid gold, and I just can't.
Oh, that's great.
Betsy's growing old. But it was all these beautiful four freshman harmonies and everything. All of a sudden, I realized these guys were like music. There was music here, like same thing you do when you realize the Beatles came out of "I Want to Hold Your Hand" into "In My Life" or something. These guys are really progressing. So then Brian became kind of the big deal in Hollywood, and all of a sudden, here's this guy that we have a connection to through Mike Connor, who was my manager, and his secretary was Ginger Blake, who was in the Honeys, which was the group that Brian Wilson's wife and sister and her had, the little girl trio, sort of girl Beach Boys kind of thing. And they never made it that big, of course. So by this time, we were kind of ebbing, the Castells. We had 2 hits, and I think we'd even changed labels by this time, and nothing was happening. So Mike said, well, why don't I approach Brian? He's looking for projects to do outside the Beach Boys to kind of, get into something different. So we said, yeah, see what he says. And he agreed to produce our group because I guess he remembered my record. Well, of course he remembered the record. And so we made this deal to have him produce the song. And I remember going into the studio. I took a meeting with him. I went over to his house to kind of discuss the song and find out what was going on. And he took me into, he was living with his future wife in her parents' home, and he had this little music room there, and he took me in the music room and he played. That's the first time I heard the Beatles' "I Want to Hold Your Hand."
I remember you saying that. That's awesome. And he thought they might be pretty good, huh?
Well, he actually would be the next big thing, is what he said.
He was right.
And what we had in those days were acetates. Nowadays, you burn a CD. Acetate was actually a thing that actually is recorded on a stylus and actually cut into the grooves, and it played 10 times before it got too rusty. And so he played this acetate of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and predicted that they were going to be the next biggest thing. And then he sat down at the piano and played "Warmth of the Sun" for me, and it was like amazing just to hear him at the piano. So we connected, and the next time that I saw him was in the studio, and we came in. The Wrecking Crew played for all my records in the early days, and for those Gen Z,
yes,
they were the most famous musicians of their day. They were first called musicians, but they weren't the legends yet that we knew them to be later. They were just the guys that you called when you wanted the best musicians in Hollywood. And people like Leon Russell and Glenn Campbell were in those groups before they were famous.
Right.
So I'm going into Western Studios expecting, because I loved the tracking. I loved when they played we always played the music first, and then we'd add our voices later. Right. Sometimes you do a scratch vocal as they played, so that there were very little click tracks in those days. Most of the records were just played with great drummers that kept good time. And so I walked in, and there's no musicians. And I said to Brian, I said, "What's up? I thought we were recording today." He said, "Well, I've already cut the track. I had cut it for the Beach Boys a couple months ago, but I'm not going to do this song with them." So all we did was put the vocals on that day. But the actual Beach Boys came down to the studio at the end. We recorded during the day, and it was about 6:00. And the Beach Boys came down to get Brian because they were going up to Capitol to record that. And so they all listened to our take, and Mike Love said, "Hey, good job on the pulse. There's a falsetto part in there." So that's the first time I think I'd met the whole band, but it was very casual and very quick. Then they invited me to go up to Capitol. It's the biggest regret of my musical life. I said no because I had to go to Pasadena and drink beer and shoot pool. And I just, it kicked me a moment for sure, because that night they recorded the Lord's Prayer, their a cappella version that sounded like the Four Freshmen. Is a beautiful version of that song. Man. And if I could go back, there's not much about my life I'd relive, but I'd relived that moment, and I'd have gone up to the studio with them. I don't know what was the matter with me, but that's what happens when you're alcoholic.
Well, but it's still a memory for a reason. There's things that happen we don't understand, but I love the fact that you had an opportunity to get to know the people in that band called the Beach Boys. It's funny you talk about vinyl, right? Here's what I found. Speaking of Beach Boys album, how about this one? This was Spirit of America.
That was
This
a collection, I think. That was
it's a collection. It was back in 75. I actually happened to see them with Chicago on July 1st at the Spectrum in Philly in 75. So if you remember that Beach Ago, I think it was concert run they went on with Chicago, and I think they were on the beach as well. But something too, and you talk about Brian Wilson, just saw him with Chicago again last year in 2022, was still touring with them. And, it's so interesting to see. You mentioned earlier, about Brian's impact and what he was able to do to help you all, and looking at his life and the opportunity he probably did have, as you even mentioned in the book, to come to know the Lord and just went a different direction. He sang, and of course, everybody knows the struggles that he had over the years, but it was pretty impressive to see a standing ovation, appreciate the talent of Brian Wilson. And I know he's had an impact on you all. And he wrote, was it I Do for you as well? Is that right? Yeah. So just to appreciating an artist at that level still to this day is well worth noting. So thanks for bringing that up.
It's a very special thing to be able to say that you were produced by Brian Wilson. There's only a few artists that can say that, other than the Beach Boys. So yeah, that's a great moment. And then later on, we actually became, through Gary Usher and all that, we became somewhat friendly. We played in a baseball league. So we played softball with Jan and Dean and Bruce Johnson and stuff. It was a fun time. Yeah, a real fun time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's just all great backdrop for this transition.
It was a time of change.
It was a grand experiment, and underneath it, I think it was a hunger to know God and truth.
Where do we go from here? Enter the Jesus movement.
God's Spirit swept across the country.
We'll let the people know Jesus is the Lord.
You could feel the presence of God in the music.
Changes in my mind.
Love Song would hear his voice.
Back in 1970, these hippies came in.
They were actually pioneers of writing songs that spoke to people outside the walls of the church.
Wow. These guys are like a combination between the Beatles and the Beach Boys.
Little country church on the edge of town.
Their songs would become part of the soundtrack of the Jesus movement.
Hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, got saved during that Jesus movement.
Love Song was a vehicle to spread the gospel with young people at that time.
The Jesus People movement and Love Song in particular, God did an incredible thing in my family's life, which has impacted me.
We started singing, and people's hearts would change. You could just see it.
Let us be one in you. Let us be one.
The Jesus Revolution exploded.
Expo 72 was an event in Dallas, Texas. It was sort of the idea of Christian Woodstock. First time many of these people had ever seen any hippies actually minister with music and rock and roll and all that.
The music of Love Song was part of the soundtrack of the last great American revival.
I think that we successfully communicate the gospel very effectively through music. That's to me what Love Song has always been about.
It is my great honor to induct Love Song into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Love you guys.
Love Song, the band, the ministry, the movement.
This was another episode of the Embracing Brokenness Podcast. For more information on Embracing Brokenness Ministries, or to subscribe to our blog, podcast, YouTube channel, or engage with us on social media, please visit our website at embracingbrokenness.org. Thanks for joining us.